evolution in form and style of Thomas Paine was a genuine anger, a righteous indignation of the conditions of the people that he was fundamentally working alongside and struggling alongside with. Remember line 24a of Plato's Apology. Socrates says, Parrhesia was the cause of my unpopularity. Parrhesia is plain speech, unintimidated speech, frank speech, speech that is unafraid. It's the language of the great Victoria Garvin or Malcolm X. It's the language of Dorothy Day, of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. It cuts through the jargon. It cuts through specialized language. It gets at the pain but doesn't remain there because it articulates a vision so that there's an alternative to that pain. That is also what's lacking. And that's what Thomas Paine had. And part of the problem is when we do have persons with those voices, what happens? Well, Thomas Paine went to jail in London. He's pushed out. He's 11 months in prison in Paris. Luckily makes it out. When he comes back here, he has a critique of George Washington. He has a critique of evangelical religion in the midst of the First Awakening. And he is completely pushed aside. So oftentimes persons who have these voices are either in prison, incarcerated, lied on, character assassinated, literally assassinated, or just pushed to the margins and viewed as some isolated icon that one worships rather than views him as part of a movement. Right. Lopez Rivera. We go on and on and on in this regard. You see? So the challenge is, how do we build on Paine's example? But we're living in a much more crypto-fascist state than he was. That's the lesson of Brother Mumia and others. Those who raise their voices. National surveillance state, the national security state is on you. The spies are operating. Folk on the inside, your friends who you thought you could rely on, no, not at all. They're cowardly. They're too conformist. They're too complacent. Who do you rely on then? That's what Thomas Paine was wrestling with most of his life. He dedicates one of the texts to George Washington, right? Next thing you know, George won't get him out of the clinker in Paris. He's living with James Madison in Paris. Then the critique of George Washington is so devastating. George Washington is the icon. When he comes to the state, they won't touch Thomas Paine with a 10-foot pole because his critique of George Washington is so unrelenting, he has pulled the cover on the demagogue. Nobody talks about George. He chopped down the cherry tree. Nobody talks about George. He sacrificed. Wait a minute. Let's tell a story that's honest and candid about George Washington, especially for someone like Thomas Paine, whose view is not just black people, but Thomas Paine in the Eastern Plan in Pennsylvania when he met with indigenous brothers and sisters and went on to write what? They were wiser than the white folk they were talking to. These were my brothers and sisters, these indigenous people. That's a vanilla brother named Thomas Paine talking that way. We don't even have white activists these days enough talking that way with indigenous peoples and brown peoples and black peoples and Asian people. Yeah, we got some in this room. I'm talking about as a movement. As a movement. Why? Because you grew up in some compartmentalized, deodorized spaces. We had very little access to black folk and red folk and yellow folk and other little vanilla suburbs and went to these nice little elite schools that got sophisticated and so forth and not any way connected to what these struggles have been. Thomas Paine refused that and he left school when he was 12 and a half. I'm not recommending that. But that's also a way in which he was not incorporated so easily by the gentlemen of his day who never accepted Thomas Paine. Never accepted John Adams, Jefferson. Even when he said good things about him, he was still a commoner. He was still so unsophisticated and raw and coarse. You know, the vicious lies told about his personal hygiene and so. It may not have been a lie, maybe he smelled a little bit. But all the lies that were unimportant relative to the issue that he was talking about. That's how rare he was